Welcome on in, golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and betting preview for this week's Worldwide Technology Championship. Going to cover all your questions down in chat and a few other things to get you ready for lock tomorrow. We'll start off with the weather report, then cycle into the DFS side, talk some strategy, ownership, a few plays I'm getting to for this week. And then at the end of this thing is where we're going to break down the prop side. So if you're here for some underdog and prize picks plays, going to cover all of that for you tomorrow and hopefully get this week started off the right way. But wherever you guys are, whether you're watching this on replay, already down there in the live chat, welcome on in, and hopefully you're having a solid Wednesday. You can see we already got Joseph down there who says it's a fun track down there in Cabo and it's wide open. Yeah, that's what I've heard about it as well. Haven't had the pleasure to play it myself, but looks like an absolute blast. So yeah, say hi down in chat if you guys are going ahead and getting into this live stream, and let's get on after this thing. So this golf course is a resort style golf course. If you saw the Black Desert Championship, I think it's going to play pretty similar to what we saw there. Now, we do have an entire year sample size, but that's it out here at this golf course. It was moved from Mayakoba to El Cardonal out here last year, and this golf course played extremely easy. So I brought up the scoring averages so we could talk about the weather a little bit, because days 1 and 3, there was a light breeze out there for most of the round. Played about 2.5 under par. You can see round 3 got a little bit easier with the moving day setup. But Sunday, they absolutely lit this golf course up. So if we take a look at the Sunday scoring average, it was 4.77 under par. In fact, the birdie average was about 6 per round out there on Sunday. So this golf course is wind dependent. Usually you get some of the coastal wind down there in Cabo. So this 2.5 under par scoring average is probably what we're going to see out there for Thursday. But if the wind dies down, if it's a windless golf course out there, you're going to see like -10, -11 rounds. And for a par 72, I think there could even be a 59 in play if it's going to be super calm. So the reason why I show you this is that it was a 2-stroke difference from the other 3 rounds to what we had on Sunday, right? It went from like 2.5 to 2.7 under par to a whole 4.77 under par. So if there's going to be any sort of weather edge that we can go out there and go after, you're going to want to try and squeeze that in. So I preface it with that as, yeah, we're about to talk about the weather here in a second. What's going on, Brant? Says Master Luke. What's going on, Brant? Hopefully you're having a solid Wednesday. Top 10 finishers last year were hardly bombers, even though it seems like a course made for bombers. Yeah, it's a putting fest. I would say a lot of that is because of how easy the golf course is. And we'll talk about that, Kim, because I think you're spot on. I don't think you have to be a bomber here, but driving distance is what you want over driving accuracy. The driving accuracy percentage, which by the way, I'll just show you this over here in Data Golf, it was 90.5% last year. So the reason why you've probably heard a few people talking about distance is when everyone's hitting fairways, the data tells us historically that it's all about power off the tee. When literally everyone's hitting the fairway, it doesn't matter, right, how accurate you are, right? Well, if you're going to be accurate this week, you might hit 95 as opposed to 90% of the fairways. There's just not enough room out there to really separate yourself. So that's why people probably talk about the power. I'm a little bit lower on that aspect than maybe some other people are, but yeah, that's a good observation. 1 year sample size I'll use as a counter to that as well. Let's talk about the weather, because I think we've got something brewing over the first few days. And we're going to go through all the different models on here to give you a taste of what they're getting for Thursday and Friday. And the Sparks Note version is that it looks like it's going to be a lot windier on Thursday than Friday. And particularly on Friday, it's going to be a lot windier in the afternoon. So I think that there could be a little bit of a PM AM wave edge out for us, because on Thursday, I think it's going to play pretty flat. Maybe the AM wave is marginally easier than the afternoon. But when we get to Friday, and it is going to be crystal clear on most of the forecasts out here for Friday, as you'll see, Friday afternoon, some of them are calm, some of them are a little bit dicey out there on Friday afternoon. Those are the guys that you're going to want to go after, the guys that are starting early over there on Friday and that are going off a little bit later tomorrow. Let's see. Any other questions? Rocking the fall swing with Master Luke. Absolutely. Cheers to that. Cheers to good golf. Yeah, dude, it's nice to have golf back. We had a week off and I was really missing it by the end of the week. So glad to be back at it. And welcome on in, Jordan. Hopefully you're having a solid Wednesday too. But let's talk about this weather thing. So we're going to go through the ECM model here first, and you'll see what I'm talking about on Thursday. It's pretty windy for most of the day, but that's kind of what you get over here in Cabo. It's usually going to be pretty breezy out there. So I don't think it's going to play hard over there tomorrow. I think it's going to be at least a 2 under par scoring average, but I don't think there's going to be a huge difference between the morning and the afternoon. while the winds do kick up a little bit as the day goes on, it is also going to be warmer over there in the afternoon, and it's going to make the golf course play a little bit shorter. So I would say that the morning might play like 0.1, 0.2 shots easier, but on Friday is where you're going to get that to flip on its head. So you can see over there on Friday morning, there's sub 7 miles an hour of sustained wind the entire day, and about doesn't get blustery in the afternoon. It does get up to like 8 to 11 miles an hour of sustained. In the wind gusts, they go from sub 10 miles an hour wind gusts in the morning to in that 15 to 17 mile an hour range in the afternoon. So as we go through these different models, actually, I'll just bring up all of them at once. I think there's a way to do that on here. Yeah, let's hit the compare button right here. Let's just go through them at the same time. So what you'll see on these models is that there's some pretty significant wind out there on Thursday in all the models. In fact, you can see this ECM here, it's pretty flat throughout the day. You can see in this icon model, similar story, same thing with Medio Blue. And then over here on Friday, if we just take a look at the morning hours, right? Every single forecast has it calm. So, I don't think it's going to be a massive edge, but what you saw last year, if we go back to the other page, was a 2-stroke advantage out there on Sunday when it was calm. So I don't think that you can completely scoff at the weather this week. And especially those guys going off early on Friday, I could see them scoring to a -4 scoring average. And, the cut line here is probably going to be like -6, -7, maybe even -8 if conditions cooperate. And if you're going out there on Friday morning and you can shoot a nuclear low round, which pretty much everyone's going to do if you're playing on a calm El Cardonal, those are the guys that I want to play, particularly with the like 6 and 7K range players. Up top, you might get away with playing guys out of the bad wave. Like you've got Graziman, bad wave. Also, who else? Keith Mitchell, who I'm still playing, of course, right? He's one of my core plays this week, right? He's going to be out of the quote unquote bad wave. So it's not like I'm only going to be playing guys that are PM AM, but I think that if your player pool is not at least like 65-35 PM AM, if not like 70-30 PM AM versus AM PM, I don't think you're playing this the right way. So when we have all these models kind of in agreement, that's when you really want to lean into a weather edge. And as you can see on here, right, we've got 4 models available in Cabo, and they're all pretty much telling us the same thing. Now, the one thing to note here is that the one difference in the afternoon over here on this model is that the icon model is pretty calm in the afternoon as well. So there's still a chance that the PM is going to be a little bit calmer over there on Friday, but if there's even a chance that it goes from like sub 5 miles an hour wind to like 10 miles an hour in the afternoon, that could lead to a pretty big difference when it comes to the scoring average. So that's what I'll say about the weather the first few days. I'm definitely incorporating it into my analysis, whether it's out there for DFS or potentially for props. I think Thursday, while it will be an easy golf course, you're not going to see a scoring average of like -4, right? It'll probably be like the -2 to -3 range out there for round 1, which we'll circle back on when we talk about props towards the end. So what I'm going to do now is bring up our DFS projections, talk through our strategy for this week. The one thing I want to talk about before we catch up on the chat, any questions down there, it's going to be the Cameron Young withdrawal. So obviously, don't play him this week. If you had him in lineups like I did, you're probably going to want to switch him out. And Ben Griffin's going to be the guy that I'm swapping him to a lot. So we'll talk about Ben Griffin here in a few minutes. He's actually one of the lower-owned plays towards the top end of the board. But the byproduct of Cam Young withdrawing isn't just the fact that we can't use him anymore. It's the effect on ownership. So the reason why I wanted to point this out before we talk about specific players is that the ownership at the top end of the board is extremely concentrated now. It's usually concentrated because we don't have a bunch of options to choose from. You want to spend all your salary. So the natural thing to do is to go out there, take a lot of guys towards the top end of the board. And you see that every single week out there. And because you had a 20% owned guy like Cam Young, a little bit under 20% go out there and withdraw, everyone got ownership up here. So whether it's Grazerman at a little bit, I think just under 30% ownership, a Bo Hostler at about 20%, a Doug Gimmett over 26% ownership, you see a lot of steam going to these top end players. And when you add on top of that, the fact that you have this weather edge that you're looking at, that's where you have guys like Ben Griffin getting a little bit of extra steam. Right? I don't think we're going to be the only ones that point out this weather edge. I imagine my boy DGen75 right after my live stream here, it's probably going to say a lot of the same things about the weather. So, you'd be kind of crazy to think that guys like Doug Gim here, Mav McNeely, these guys that are in the PM wave tomorrow aren't going to be a little bit higher owned than what they otherwise would be. So I accounted for that in my projections. I made sure that my Patreon members, right, have the most up-to-date information there, but it's not keeping me off the advantage, right? They're going to get maybe an extra 1-2% ownership out there in a few cases. You add on top of that, though, the steam that you're getting with Cam Young, and That's where it's a little bit of a tough scene out there with the ownership up top. So the byproduct of all of that is that I think you're going to have to take some chalk towards the top end of the board. If you're playing a weather edge, you're going to have to because of some inflated ownership. And if you want to spend all your salary, you're going to have to take some chalk up here. So I don't think that you want to talk yourself off of players because of ownership at the top end of the board. Like even a Grazerman, he is in the AM wave, which I don't love about it. Even though he's nearly 30% owned, doesn't make him an automatic fade. It's not like he's 30% owned and then everyone else is like 14, 15%. It's like he's 30% owned and then everyone is like 20% owned around him. So sure, you're getting a higher ownership on some of these guys up here, but don't make that think that you have to go out there and fade them. And I guess just for full transparency, I'm not playing Grazerman, so I'm not telling you to go out there and use them by any means, but it's more so that you don't have to fade them for ownership concerns. That's at least my opinion on a week like this, when you have such condensed ownership up there towards the top. So Ben Griffin, let's go through this play. Before the news with Cam Young, he actually was a little bit lower owned. He was like 13, maybe 13.5% owned out there in my projections. I like the fact that he's PM wave, and I like that he's a good putter at one of these birdie fests. The main thing I'm looking for in players this week, approach play is nice, form is okay, right? Like those are a few boxes that I'm looking for. The main thing though is shots gained putting. Like, can you go out there and spike for 4 shots gained putting? That doesn't mean that you have to play only like putting first players. I mean, if you guys saw my bets, I'm not only going for putting first players, but you can be a putting first player and get there. Like you got guys like Chesson Hadley and Nate Lashley last year have a lot of success at this event. A lot of your top 5, top 10 were guys that were poppers with the putter. Winner though, EVR, not so much a popper with the putter. So obviously there are exceptions to the rule, right? You can point out your Lashley, some of those putting first players. You're also going to get some of your ball strikers that show up too. So Ben Griffin, he's obviously going to get it done with more of the short game. If you take a look at his shots gained heading in, he's been a little bit shaky with the off the tee and approach. The short game's been there like you'd expect. But if you zoom out a little bit more, the approach play gets a lot better. He's gaining about a half a stroke approach per round if you zoom out to the last 24 measured rounds. So if he can go out there, gain us a few strokes on approach, do his thing with the flat stick, I like that. At slightly lower ownership than some of the other guys around him. Like, for example, Doug Gim's way chalkier, and then Grazerman, as I mentioned, is about 30% himself. The ownership at the bottom end of the 9K range isn't as condensed. So I would say, other than Matty Schmidt, who's really chalky at $9,600, like your Glovers, your McNeelys, these sort of players are a little bit lower owned than some of their counterparts. They get down here to a Harry Hall. He's pretty chalky. A lot of people are trying to tail that for me as. Even like a JJ Spawn is getting some ownership there too. I don't think you have to talk yourself off of some of these more popular players. I think you're just inevitably going to have to play some chalk up here in that 9 and 10K range. But it's nice when you can find a lower owned option to get to. So Ben Griffin is one of those guys that's a little bit lower owned than his peers. It's not like you have to force that in, but it's nice to get that where you can, like I said. Keith Mitchell, $9,100. We saw my breakdown earlier this week. Maybe you didn't see my tweet about my outright card. I did end up taking him at 33-1. So his ownership was relatively low, like expected. The form was a little bit shaky the last few starts. So I don't have him in that 15 to 20% range, like guys like a Harry Hall, for example. So if you're looking for a slight discount on ownership, just like a Ben Griffin, comparatively, Keith Mitchell was low owned compared to the guys around him. Speaking of low ownership, if you like form, look the other way. But Tom Hoge has not had his best fall swing, but he's $8,300. Long-term is one of the better players in this field. And he's sub 10% owned, which you can't say about a lot of these 8K range players. So for Tom Hoge, he's a little bit of a diamond in the rough, certainly a risky play because of that form, but he fits this golf course to a T. And the one thing that I think can really boost you around this golf course, there's actually two things that really boost a play around this course. Off the tee doesn't matter that much. At least in my opinion, off the tee is de-emphasized at this course. I think if you're long off the tee, that's a nice bonus to have, but you certainly don't have to be long if we look at the leaderboard from last year. And the other thing is around the green does not matter here. You're going to have players that maybe only miss like 2-3 greens the entire week. And Tom Hoge, because of his approachability, could be that kind of guy. I mean, there's 8,000, 9,000 square foot greens around this golf course. So down here at 9% projected ownership, I think it's a really good course fit because his main weakness is off the tee. Doesn't really have to worry about that this week. He's also not the best around the green player. So you take away those two really Achilles heels that Tom Hoge can have, you let him lean into the approach play and that putting, which can be electric out there for him. And that's exactly what we're looking for this week. So sub 10% owned, I'll take him. I still like Rico Hoge. I did end up betting him at 40-1, by the way. So that was something else that I tweeted out there on X, but he's 17% owned. So if I can afford the ownership, let's say I have pivots down there in that 6 and 7K range, then maybe you still play Rico Hoge, right? I'm going to have plenty of them out there in lineups. But if you're actively looking to get different down here in the 8K range, there are not a ton of options that you can get to, but Tom Hoge would be one of those players. So, of course, guys, if you want to see all my projections, the ownership to try and find some of those pivots, make sure to check out my projections over there on my Patreon page. Link in the description of this live stream to check that out. And I guess I'll give you one extra one. Taylor Moore is also going to be about sub 10% owned. So if you're looking to get different in this range, you have a few players that you can use, but Matt Kuchar is going to be chalky, and Eric Van Rooyen after the win is going to be relatively popular. Hoey, he's getting some ownership there. You can use those kind of players. It's not like I think you have to avoid them, as I've said multiple times by now, but there's a cost to doing so. If you take that chalk there in the 8-9K range, you're certainly going to have to offset it at another spot in your lineup. Still playing some Daniel Berger. He's a PM Wave golfer, which is great. By the way, the only player we've talked about so far that is AM Wave would be Keith Mitchell. And a lot of the guys that I'm using out of the bad wave are going to be players that I was on there on Monday, whether it's core plays, value plays, or conviction plays that I already had in my player pool. If they're not one of those handful of guys that I pointed out there in my just the beginning parts of my process, then I'm probably not going to play it out of the AM wave. So down here with Daniel Berger, we lucked out with a lot of these guys being on the proper side, and he's only about 10% owned. So I thought he might be a little bit higher owned because of the price tag. In my opinion, he's by far the best player at this portion of the leaderboard. Like, you compare him to the guys around him, and I don't think it's particularly close. Recent form, you could say that some of these guys have been playing a little bit better, but long-term, I don't think it's close at all. So 10% ownership, I think, is very reasonable on Berger. I'll get over the field at $7,900. Let's see. If you have any questions, by the way, about specific players, just feel free to go ahead and throw those down in chat. We're going to quickly go through these 7 and 6K range players and then build a few lineups together. We're going to keep this thing moving today because it's fall swing. I honestly want to keep this quick, concise. Don't want to keep you guys here for an entire hour if we can, because why do that if I can just do it quicker, right? I've watched my live streams. I like watching them over, trying to critique myself, figure out where I can get a little bit better. And I think being more concise would be a good way to do that. So Justin Lauer will be the next play. So the one thing to note about the 7K range, guys, is that the ownership is relatively spread out. Like, there's no one in the 7K range that is egregious chalk. In terms of your ownership, players like a Pan Kazire, I guess, is getting a little chalky. He's a little bit over 12% owned. And Echeverria, winner from last week, he's also a little bit more popular than the rest of the players in this range. But especially when you start to get down towards the bottom end of the 7K range, ownership starts to flatten out quite a bit. In fact, outside of like a Henrik Norlander, who's about 10% owned himself, a Nick Hardy is getting some attention as well. So I'll point out the few players here that are a little bit chalkier. Joe Highsmith too. He's definitely chalky. In fact, I think he's the highest owned player down there in the 7K range. Outside of those 4 or 5 players that we just mentioned, there's not a ton of ownership down here in the 7K range. There's mostly guys in that 3 to 7% range. So obviously we're going to mention Chad Ramey here in a minute. Justin Lauer's down here at about 9% ownership. These sort of guys are the players that I prefer. I mean, this 7K range is pretty weak. Some of the chalky pieces, by the way, like a Joe Highsmith, I get the form has been good, but like, do we really trust Joe Highsmith at like 15% ownership? Somebody like Henrik Norlander, even, like, I know the form has been decent. He usually kills these fall swing events, but do we trust him at 10% ownership? Like, I personally don't. Echeverria, like, I know he won last week, but this is a very, very inconsistent player. I mean, do we trust him in 30% of our lineups? Probably not, right? So down here in the 7K range, up top, I thought you could take some chalk and probably get away with it. Down here in the 7K range, you should be very careful about the ownership and the players that you're using. If you're going to take somebody over 10% owned, really like them. Again, maybe make it somebody on Monday that you used as a conviction play. Maybe an outright that you took on your betting card. If you just kind of like someone down there in the 7K range and you think like, oh, the form has been pretty good recently, that's okay if it's like a 2 to 5% owned player. But if you're playing, I think Joe Highsmith, I hate to pick on a specific player because I feel like every time I do this, the guy ends up like top 5ing because just out of spite, right? If you talk shit about a player, they go out there and prove you wrong. But I'm going to do it with Joe Highsmith, right? Like Joe Highsmith, great form. Like if he was a 5% owned play in the 7K range, he'd be an absolute smash play. I totally agree with you if you think that, right? He's 3-4 times higher owned. Like it's a completely different scenario, right? And if he's 15 to 20% owned, than if he's going to be like 5% owned, or especially if he's like 2-3% owned, like some of the other players in this range. So just understand that, and especially in large field GPPs, I think that's even more important if you're playing in like the big GPPs this week. If you're in single entry, you might be able to get away with playing a Joe Highsmith or one of these like 10 to 15 percenters, but you still got to be a little bit careful about it. Next play we're going to talk through, though, is Justin Lauer. As I prefaced, he's only about 9% owned, and he's one of those putting first players that you take at a putting contest, a birdie fest, like we have here for this week. So he's $7,500. He's in the proper wave. You can see 11:27 start time. They're starting a little bit earlier. They're on mountain time also to make sure they can get in all the play because of daylight savings. So 9.2% ownership. I'll get well over the field on Lauer, as his form's also been pretty solid. You can see in terms of recent form ranking, he's number 16 in the field. Sure, he's not number 7 like Joe Highsmith, but just to show you how silly this is, right? Joe Highsmith is only gaining 0.3 strokes more per round, right? So that means over that 12 rounds, he's gained 3.6 strokes more than the other player, which is significant, especially over a 12-round sample size. But we're acting like this guy has been a world killer for the last few events, when in reality, he has just been marginally better than the player that's right around him. So, that's why I say, like, have a reality check if you're playing a lot of chalk down there in the 7K range, because there are guys like Lauer, and there are even better examples of lower owned players that you can get to that are playing just as well, maybe slightly worse than some of those super chalky guys, but that I think have the same kind of upside this week. So yeah, I like Lauer as a little bit of a pivot off that chalk. Chad Ramey would certainly qualify as that as well. He's only here at about 3.8% ownership, and he's another one of those putting first players. He's starting in the proper wave over there in the PM side, and he's played really well at these easier tracks. He's not the best out there at a hard off the tee course. He's relatively short and inaccurate off the tee, but you put him at a golf course like this that is completely wide open, and he's going to have a much better chance to go out there and succeed. And once again, you take a look at the form here, he's number 17 in the field. If you compare him to a guy like a Norlander, he's actually got better form than Henrik Norlander, and he's 3 times lower owned. Like, what are we doing down here in the 7K range? Like, why are we all playing the same players when pretty much they're all the same? I mean, there are a few guys with really shitty form that probably should be like 1-2% owned out there in GPPs, but there are a ton of them that are still low owned that are still playing well. So I think the key down here, right, is you want to play guys with form that a good course fits. You always want to do that out there in PGA DFS. But don't take the guys that are 15 to 20% out. Like, it's just, there's no reason to go out there and do so. You might get away with it week to week out there, but long-term, you're going to get burned if you're doing that. Chesson Hadley, another one of these putting first players that I'm using. He's only about 3% owned, so also going to give you a little bit of leverage there. And he's starting in the proper side of tee time. So at Chesson Hadley, he hasn't had the best form lately. In fact, he's losing 0.8 strokes per round over his last 12 rounds. But it's the course fit that I like. It's the fact that he plays well at easier tracks. He plays well towards the end of the season. He plays decently during the fall swing. This is the kind of event where Chesson Hadley historically shows up. So I'll play him. Still taking some Cam Champ. I actually thought he'd be a lot higher owned than where I have him. So you can see the ownership number there is only about 4.1% out there in GPPs. I thought Cameron Champ might be closer to like 7-8% owned. So I think the form is a little bit sneaky. It's been up and down, a little bit inconsistent. So that's why he's only gaining about 0.2 strokes per round, but he's been a lot better over here on the fall swing in the categories that count. He's always going to kill it off the tee. That hasn't changed, but he's been losing less strokes on approach than usual, and he's been a lot better with the flat stick than what we had for most of the regular season. So $7,000 starting on the right side of tee times. Yeah, especially when he's sub 5% owned, I'll definitely play Cam Champ. Joel Damon, another guy you could take for some leverage. You can see he's only about 3.3% owned. That's usually what I'm looking for in these guys down low, right? About 5% is usually where I cap out my ownership on a 6K range player. And Joel Damon, the form hasn't been there either, but long-term, he plays well at courses where off the tee is de-emphasized. He's not the longest player off the tee. He is pretty accurate off the tee, which honestly doesn't matter at this kind of golf course. It's more so the driving accuracy not being a massive factor, which is kind of nice out there for Joel Damon. He's got to figure out the form, though. He's been playing absolute shit heading in. So this is definitely a risky play, but Joel Damon, when he has his best stuff, a lot of times it's a top 10 or a top 20. And at $6,800, if he were to give us a top 15, we'd probably feel pretty happy about that. Top 10, and he's almost for sure optimal down here at this kind of price. David Lipsky, I'm still using, but I'm a little bit lower on now that he's down in the bad wave. He's starting in the AM wave, so maybe a slightly worse play than what he was before, but I'm still going to use him out there in lineups. As I mentioned with Keith Mitchell, I still have a handful of other guys out there in the AM wave. I don't think it's the kind of weather edge that you have to only take guys playing on the proper side, but it could be like a half a stroke difference, which definitely matters when you lock it in for most of your players. So as I mentioned before, unless you loved the guy to start the week, he was one of your conviction plays out there on Monday or Tuesday, then you probably shouldn't be playing somebody that is starting in the AM side. So yeah, if you don't love David Lipsky like I did, honestly, you guys watching this probably shouldn't like David Lipsky as much as me, right? Because you weren't the ones making these plays, pointing them out to people. That then don't use David Lipsky would be my advice, right? If you're not on that kind of scenario. So if you're one of the rare few people out there, maybe the 5% of you that were on David Lipsky, maybe still use them, but if not, leave them to me and maybe lower the ownership a little bit out there in those GPPs. But yeah, obviously I like the form with Lipsky. That was the main reason for getting to him. And I thought the ownership might get closer to like 5%, but he's still only here at about 3.3% projected ownership, which is pretty sweet. If it stays around that number, I'm going to be absolutely thrilled tomorrow. And like I said, unless you absolutely love him, don't use him because I'll take the lower ownership on him. That's for damn sure. Let me see if there's any specific player questions. If not, we're going to build a lineup, then hop over to props. So let me bring up DraftKings. Looks like we're good on questions. If you have any, let me know because we're going to move on to props here rather soon. So if you want to talk about anything with DFS, go ahead and fire it down there now because you won't have a chance after we get to props. So let's talk through this lineup construction. So I'm going to build this lineup like we're building for the large field GPP. If you're going to build for a single entry, something that's a little bit smaller field, then you're going to worry about ownership a little bit less. It's that simple, right? We're going to worry about ownership quite a bit out here in the large field GPP. If you're playing in a smaller field contest, single entry, whatever the case may be, just you get less leverage, right? We're going to go for 2-3 pivots out here in this lineup. If you're playing in single entry, you need 1 or 2 pivots in the lineup. You need 2 pivots if you're playing a lot of chalk out there in the single entry. But if you're playing mild ownership across the board, 1 sub 5%er, 1 sub 3% owned play out there in the lineup, and you're probably good out there in a single entry or smaller field GPP. So we're not going to build a lineup for that scenario, but just take this and scale back the ownership talk a little bit. And that's what you can do for that kind of contest. So let's start up top with the Ben Griffin. He's 19% owned. So, we're not going to call him a pivot, but he's average to below average ownership towards the top end of the board. Our second man in, we're also going to go with a pivot in Keith Mitchell. Unfortunately, he is on the wrong side of tee times, but not every lineup that I build for a large field GPP is going to be playing only PM AM guys. Half my lineups at least are going to be only PM AM, maybe even more than 50% of my lineups will be PM AM, but not every build, as we've mentioned. So let's start with those two. It puts us at about 77.5 remaining, which means we need one more 8K guy to make this lineup construction work. So let's try and find somebody here that we'll actually take some ownership. So just for the sake of showing you that you can play some chalk, I was going to say, let's find a pivot, really try and find low ownership at all 6 spots, but that's kind of overkill. And I'm going to show you guys, we could take pivots at all 6 spots. If we do that, we're for sure fine right out there with our product ownership in our lineup. But you don't have to be that crazy about your lineup construction. Like if there are some popular guys that you want to get to, like you can make it work. So for example, just to show you what that would look like if you really liked Cooch this week, I do not. It's a birdie fest. Historically, he's not been very good at birdie fest. So the fact that he played well here last year is, I think, pretty surprising out there for Matt Kuchar. We're going to throw him in here, though, just for the sake of this lineup. This isn't a lineup that I'd be getting to because it has Kuchar in it, but the point of that is to show you that you can take some ownership. And in fact, we're going to take one more relatively popular player here just to really hammer home this point. So towards the top end of the 7K range, it'd be a little bit too cheap, I guess, to go to a Kazire because he's only $7,600. I do want to kind of spread out the lineup construction in our salary a little bit more. So let's go with a Daniel Berger. He's not mega chalky, but he's 10% owned. We've got Kuchar at over 15%. We've got Keith Mitchell at over 12%, nearly 13% ownership. And we've got Ben Griffin at nearly 20% there. This is for the large field GPP, by the way. And I think you can get away with this kind of start. You've got 4 guys. You can't really call any of them pivots. You've got 2 guys that are about average ownership, 2 guys that are a little bit over average ownership out there in any given range. As long as your last 2 spots are 2 pivots, and by pivot, I mean like sub 5% owned player, be totally fine out there for the large field GPP. So to show you an example of that, let's go down here and throw in, let me actually go back to my projections and make sure I can find somebody at sub 5%, because if we go to $7,500, I don't know who's sub 5% off the top of my head. So let me just check over on my spreadsheet. Actually, there's not that many in that range that are sub 5% owned. I guess we could go with a Bridgman. He's 8.7%. I've also got Svenny at 8.8% himself. Svensson is in the AM wave, though. So I do want to point that out. If you're using Svensson, he is on the quote unquote wrong side of tee times. But if you want with Svensson, he's going to be a little bit lower owned than some of the other guys around him. And because he's not sub 5%, our last man in here, I want sub 3% on this last player. So we're just going to force our hand just a little bit more than we were before. So if we went with Joel Damon, he's about 3%. We could go with Lipsky. He's in that same kind of range. You might want to force in just a little bit more differentiation. So let me actually look over at that spreadsheet one more time. And at the top end of that 6K range, there's a few guys we could go with. So let me pick my favorite. We'll go with Matthew Neesmith there at $6,900. So he's a sub 2% owned, Matthew Neesmith, that is. So all you had to do to make this lineup different enough was not take mega chalk with your top 4 players. Like we still had some chalk, but it wasn't like the 30% owned guys like Grazerman or Doug Ginn. And then down low, you just were intentional about getting a little bit different with your last 2 players. Svensson is only a little bit of leverage, right? He's still over 5% owned. But Matthew Neesmith is where we're getting almost all of our leverage in this lineup and all of our differentiation as well. So this is only to show you could take more pivots if you wanted to, right? I mentioned the fact that we only took Matt Kuchar there just to show you that you could take chalk. I'd probably be more likely to play a Tom Hoge in this kind of scenario, right? So maybe rather than finishing off with a Matt Neesmith, you can take a little bit more ownership because we're not going as chalky up there in that 8K range. And maybe that's where you finish off with the Hadley instead. Hadley, a little bit of a better play than Matt Neesmith, in my opinion. Also a little bit higher owned, though, so you have to do it in the right scenario. But because we offset some of the ownership towards the 8K range, you can get away with a little bit more down there at the bottom end of your lineup. So hopefully it gives you a little bit of a feel for going out there and building for large field GPPs. But if you're building for single entry, smaller field contest, that kind of thing, all you have to do, and you don't even have to alter your process. You could take GPP lineups and enter them into single entries, smaller field stuff. But if you wanted to take more ownership, you could afford to do so. So like if you really like Grayson, you like Gim towards the top, Gim is a PM wave starter. So he's in my player pool out there for this week. Like if you're going to use a Doug Gim, maybe it's better to do it out there in a single entry or smaller field contest. So that's all I'll say about that. Let me get a sip of water and then we'll talk about some prop stuff. And speaking of, I already got 5 props that I've entered. So I'll try and make it the best 2 props over here for the live stream, and we'll build a little slip together. But just like the stuff we had over there for DFS, if you guys want all of the Prize Picks underdog slips that I'm entering for round 1 and the rest of the season, make sure to check out the Patreon page for that. But what I'm doing here is bringing up Prize Picks, which I have to bring up live here on live stream. You guys already know the deal with that. So we can go through some of the props that I've taken. So my favorite prop that I've taken so far is the Keith Mitchell over on birdies. So I'm definitely going to make that one of the 2 props that we're going with. Then I got to kind of think about what we're going to use as the other prop. So I've got some birdie props that I've taken, which again, we're only going to cover 2 here just for the sake of this live stream. Let's make it Rico Hoey. So the reason why I'm picking these 2 in particular is they're not only props that I've taken that I thought were solid value, they're on players that I really like this week. I mean, I bet Keith Mitchell outright. Rico Hoey is also a guy that I took outright this week. So we'll make it these 2 props that we go through. So first one's going to be this over on Keith Mitchell birdies. The average last year, just to go back to the sheet over here, was 5.26 per round. So the actual scoring average was 3.19 over the 4 days. But what you have to remember about this average is that it was a lot better out there on Sunday. So if you're just joining us Sunday when there was no wind out there, it played to a 4.77 under par scoring average. So days 1 through 3, the birdie average was actually closer to about 5 per round. So for Keith Mitchell to get to 6, he's going to have to gain a birdie to the field, which I would say in most fields would be about where you'd project him, especially if it was like a normal strength field. But this is one of the weakest fields in all of golf. I mean, this is a fall series event. You have a lot of scrubs playing in this kind of tournament. So, and you even have like some local Mexican players that aren't even on the PGA Tour. They're going to be teeing it up alongside these players, and that did last year. That also impacted that average quite a bit. Somebody like Keith Mitchell in this kind of field gains like a birdie and a half to the field. He's the number 2 birdie maker in all the PGA Tour. The only player that makes more birdies per round than Keith Mitchell is literally Scotty Scheffler. There's no one else on the planet this year that has a higher birdie percentage than Keith Mitchell. So in this field, he's the king of all the scrubs. if he's the number 2 birdie maker in all the PGA Tour, and he's already averaging a birdie more than a PGA Tour average field. You put him in a field like this, and that's at least a birdie and a half, maybe even 2 birdies per round. So the 5 birdie average, I don't think is that big of an issue when you're playing a player like Keith Mitchell, who's an absolute stud. So he's an AM wave player. I think the winds will be a little bit more favorable early on, but I do think the temperatures are going to be lower. So with the lower temperatures, I like the fact that he is a longer player. And I say lower temperatures, but it's going to be like 70 degrees in the morning. So it's not like it's going to be cool out there or anything, but the ball might travel just a little bit less distance than what you have in the afternoon. So I like the fact that he is a power player there. And then the other prop I took was his under on Rico Hoge strokes, which you don't have any lines for comparison over here on Sportsbooks, but I'll actually just bring up a few real quick. We have odds on DraftKings. We also have odds on Caesars that we can compare to. A lot of players that are of inferior quality are projected for like minus 135 to minus 150 in either direction. So let me show you what that looks like, because these two, I would argue, are better players than the guys I'm going to show you for comps. And even though we're not going to have that exact line to compare to, I'm not worried about it when they're literally better players. So why would we worry about that? So let's go over here to DraftKings, show you what we're looking at here first. So if we go here to the birdie board, you'll see that Matty Schmid is at 5.5 birdies. It is minus 150 for his over. Harry Hall is at 5.5, and he's minus 135 over. Bo Hostler is minus 135 for his over. Hostler is the number 33 birdie maker on the PGA Tour. Matty Schmid is the number 20 birdie maker on the PGA Tour. Yes, I know I'm sick in the head for knowing those off the top of my head, but when you have the number 2 birdie maker on the PGA Tour, if these guys are minus 135, minus 150, what do you think the number 2 birdie maker is going to be? I mean, obviously, even more juice than that. So Keith Mitchell, I think, is a solid plus EV lean. Even without the line comparison, he'd be even more juice than what you have with those other players. And then here with Rico Hoge, I'm going to show you some of these strokes lines, and I'll show you the birdie lines over here in Caesars too. They're pretty much the exact same. So it's not gonna really have us leaning one direction or the other. See Keith Mitchell, sorry, not Keith Mitchell, that's Harris English there. They both went to the same college. That's why I'm getting them mixed up. He's about even money at 5.5. Graserman's minus 145 over, pretty close to even money on Doug Gim. But look at that, Hostler's minus 140, Matty Schmid minus 140. A player that is significantly better at birdie better percentage is going to be even better than those kind of options. And now looking at the strokes board, so I did want to show you that over there for Rico Hoge. So we take a look at the strokes board. Harris English, who, by the way, Rico's been a lot better than recently in terms of recent form, he's minus 145 for his under. Graserman is down here at 67.5, right? So he's an entire stroke lower. He is juiced a little bit over, but he's only minus 145 for the over. Doug Gim, minus 155 under. Bo Hostler, Matty Schmid, 2 players that I think are worse players than Rico Hoge long-term, are minus 145 for their under. So Rico Hoge, somebody I bet outright this week. I obviously think he has a good chance to go out there and have some success. And just like Keith Mitchell, he's a relatively long player off the tee. Now, he does have a PM tee time, so the temperatures are going to help him out a little bit, but that's only going to be helpful, I guess. It's not a bad thing to be playing when the ball's traveling its furthest. It will be a little bit windier over there in the PM wave low. So that's why I took that under. And just to show you, they still have the PM guys over here juiced way under. They actually added a Keith Mitchell prop. They didn't have this one up here before, but he's minus 135 for the under. These PM guys are still juiced way under. So you can see Harris English there, right? He's PM wave and he was minus 150 under. Ben Griffin was minus 150 under. Doug Gim, by the way, over here in DraftKings is minus 165 for his under over there on that book. So Hoge would be at least minus 135 odds, would be my guess in terms of its sportsbook juice, if not closer to the minus 145 to minus 165 that you have on some of those other players. So this pays 2.75x because of the correlation. And just because the payout sucks, I'm going to give you guys one more prop, because if you play a 3-man slip, you get 4.75x for the 3, which in terms of EV, it's about the same as the 2.75x, but I personally prefer it. So let me think. I've got 3 others to choose from. Which one are we going to go with? Thinking about it. I have a bunch to choose from, so that's why it's kind of hard to choose. But we'll go with the Matty Schmid one. So if you saw the odds on these sites, you probably know I'd want to take the over on Matty Schmid birdies. He's the number 20 birdie maker on the PGA Tour. That is top 10 in this field. So though he's not number 1 like Keith Mitchell, that's still really solid in this field of 120 players. And Matty Schmid is minus 150 for his over here. And then if we go back to Caesars, I think it was minus 140, but either way, that's solid odds over there on both sites. So if you're looking for plus EV leans, in my opinion, all three of these would be plus EV leans. I have to say my opinion because we technically don't have the odds to compare to for the top two. But yeah, if you play this, it would be a 4.75x payout. So this isn't the exact combination that I took out there for my slips, but still three of the best props that you can take on the board. If you wanted to actually, yeah, we'll leave it at those three, right? I got to leave some behind the paywall over there for the Patreon members. So as I said before, if you want to see all the exposure that I'm getting to, make sure to check out the Patreon page for all that information. But unless there's any questions, I think we're going to be done with this live stream. So let's see. Do I feel like -4 is a lot to ask for these guys? It was windy days 1 through 3, Mark, and I'll show you the scoring average. No, the answer is no, right? The short answer is no to your question because it was windy the first 3 days and it still played 2.5 under par. So I'm not going to give away the Data Golf projections, but if you're a part of their website and you check out their projections, they're expecting it to play about 2.2 under par, which is maybe marginally harder than what they had last year. But if we sort the scores by round 1, Cameron Piercy shot -10. Camilo shot -8. We got to go the whole way down here to, I'm not going to count all these off the top of my head, but that's like nearly 40 players that shot 68 or better. So that was about a third of the field that was getting to that score. And you're talking about a weak field event. The guys that we actually have on sites like Prize Picks and Underdog are way better than the field average. In fact, if you take a look at like the players on the board here and their success over the fall swing, almost every single player on the board here is gaining about a stroke and a half to the field, which is not their regular, right? These are guys that are normally like a half a stroke gain to the field because of how weak the fields are in the fall swing, though. They play better. They look better because they're playing against weaker field events. So yeah, to answer your question, the answer is no, because it was windy last year and they still tore this golf course apart. When it gets calm, it plays to 5 under par, right? And if it was going to play to 5 under par, we're getting lines on those guys that are like 66.5 strokes, right? So, yeah, I don't think so. It's pretty to par, I would say, Mark. And yeah, I disagree with that. May have missed it, but what is everyone seeing the wind and wave advantage? Roth on Roto Grinders isn't even mentioning it. Yeah, I guess he's got his opinion, but I'll show you right here. I did a whole section on it earlier. I'm not going to do the entire talk again because I spent probably 10, 15 minutes on it. But if you want to go back and watch it, you can. The Spark Notes version is that it's windy all day Thursday. So you take a look at the forecast here. I have all 4 up, by the way, out here for Cabo. So not just one forecast to look at like some other people do, like maybe Mr. Roth. But if you take a look at Thursday, it looks windy the entire day. So some of them are worse than others. Like you take a look at this ECM or this icon model, looks kind of nasty tomorrow, right? Like 13 to 15 miles an hour is nothing to sneeze at. Like that's maybe a little bit worse than what it was for the first few days last year. That's why I think it might play only like -2, -2.2 under par, like Data Golf does. Like I tend to agree with Data Golf on that sense. But if you take a look at Friday, this is where the edge comes in, right? It looks pretty flat on Thursday. Like that doesn't look like a massive advantage. Friday, though, it looks calm in the morning. Every single forecast here has it calm in the morning. It's not like one of them does. It's not like it's, one of them that's calm and then 2 that are kind of calm. They're all sub 5 miles an hour wind, right? So that looks like a perfect window to go out there and play. And while not every single model agrees that's going to get windier in the afternoon, 3 out of the 4 do, right? You can see over here, the top one, second one, and the bottom one all think that's going to get a little bit windier as the day goes on. The only one that's counter to that is this icon model, and it still gets a little bit windier as the day goes on, right? It's not as drastic as what you have in the other models, but just circle back to these averages. When it went from a little bit of wind to no wind, that was a 2-stroke difference, right? So if it's going to go from no wind to kind of windy, I'm not saying it's going to be a 2-stroke difference, right? I think that would be crazy talk. But it could be a stroke difference between the morning and the afternoon on Friday. And if that's the case, you definitely want to play that. Like that's not a small edge out there in DFS. So we're definitely going to have to take a look at the forecast when we do our round 2 showdown live stream to see what's going on. But yeah, I think if you don't see a weather edge, I'm not going to be mean. I'm not going to say what I wanted to. But yeah, I definitely see a weather edge. That's all I'll see about that. Alrighty, guys, that is all I've got out there for the live stream this week. Hopefully you found it helpful for all of your exposure. Best of luck with whatever you guys are getting to, whether it's on the betting side, DFS, or over there for props. We're doing our round 2 through 4 live streams as per usual, so make sure to stop on by for all of those, and hopefully you can make this one a good one. It's nice to have golf back on the schedule. You have a few more events here for the fall swing, and then obviously 2025 coming around the corner. So I'm stoked for that. By the way, 2025 going to be a massive year here for the channel. So if you guys enjoyed the golf stuff so far, it's only going going to get better out there for next year. So subscribe, make sure you don't miss any of the content to come, and let's have ourselves a week, guys.